Number 1. Rex Heuermann. For more than a decade, the killer believed time itself had erased him. Long Island's South Shore had always carried a quiet menace, wind moving through scrub grass, the constant hum of traffic along Ocean Parkway, the Atlantic pressing against land that looked calm from a distance but hid everything beneath it. When the first bodies were discovered near Gilgo Beach in 2010, the shock rippled outward, but the fear settled inward. Someone had been killing women sex workers, mostly, and placing them where no one would stumble upon them by accident. The investigation surged, stalled, fractured, and slowly decayed under its own weight. And through it all, Rex Heuermann went home every night. He lived openly, worked openly, paid taxes, attended meetings, designed buildings, argued over zoning laws, complained about traffic, raised children. He did not flee. He did not hide. He did not confess. He waited. Because men like Heuermann do not rely on luck. They rely on systems aging poorly. The victims were discovered in clusters, wrapped carefully, placed deliberately. The pattern was undeniable, yet the suspect pool was endless. Early investigative failures, jurisdictional infighting, and internal corruption within local law enforcement crippled momentum. Years passed. Leads went cold. Families buried their grief alongside fading hope. DNA existed, but DNA without a name is only a whisper. Heuermann understood that. He understood that forensic science, for all its promise, still depended on databases, on samples, on someone else making a mistake. As long as he remained ordinary, invisible in plain sight, the numbers would protect him. He believed he had gotten away with it. What he did not anticipate was the quiet revolution happening far from Long Island, inside laboratories, inside public genealogy databases, inside algorithms designed to map bloodlines backward through time. He did not anticipate that strangers uploading saliva samples out of curiosity would one day form the net that closed around him. Investigators revisited the Gilgo Beach case with new eyes. They returned to the evidence: hair fibers recovered from burlap, trace DNA preserved but never fully understood. This time, they did not look for a match in criminal databases. They looked for relatives. The DNA did not identify a killer. It identified a family. From there, the work became slow and methodical. Family trees, census records, marriage certificates, geographic overlap, occupations, vehicles, patterns of movement. A name began to surface repeatedly, hovering near the center of everything like a shadow that refused to resolve. Rex Heuermann, an architect, a man with a history of meticulous planning, a man whose work required precision, foresight, and patience. A man whose physical description matched eyewitness accounts from years earlier. A man whose phone records placed him in proximity to victims at critical moments. Still, suspicion is not proof. Investigators followed him for months. They watched what he discarded. They waited for the smallest lapse in his discipline, and eventually, it came not through confession, not through violence, but through trash. A pizza box, a napkin, DNA. When the results came back, the match was no longer statistical abstraction. It was definitive. The DNA recovered from the crime scenes aligned with the DNA taken from discarded items tied directly to Heuermann, with family members who had unknowingly helped build the genetic bridge. The killer who believed time had buried his crimes was exposed by time instead. His arrest sent a shockwave through Long Island and far beyond it, not because serial killers are unheard of, but because this one had waited so long, lived so openly, and trusted that history had failed him in his favor. The man who believed himself untouchable was handcuffed in public, his ordinary life collapsing in real time. Neighbors expressed disbelief. Colleagues struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the allegations. His family was thrust into a nightmare they did not choose and could not escape. And the families of the victims were forced to relive everything, this time with answers, but no relief. DNA does not bring peace, it brings truth. What makes the Heuermann case especially chilling is not just the brutality of the alleged crimes, but the patience, the confidence, the belief that systems decay faster than guilt. He lived in an era where killers once slipped through cracks and assumed those cracks would remain. They didn't. The science kept moving, quietly, relentlessly. While he aged, while memories faded, while headlines changed, DNA technology sharpened its teeth. It did not forget. It did not forgive. It waited. And when it finally spoke, it did not accuse. It exposed. Killers who believe they have gotten away often mistake silence for safety. In reality, silence is just time gathering evidence. The modern world remembers in ways the past never could. Every hair, every cell, every careless discard becomes a future witness. Rex Heuermann did not outsmart justice. He outlasted Pickton till justice learned how to outlast him. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Lonnie Franklin Jr. spent nearly a quarter-century believing he had beaten the system, not by running, not by hiding, but by blending so completely into the background that the city itself absorbed him. Los Angeles swallowed his crimes the way it swallows noise, slowly, unevenly, and without ever truly going quiet. From the mid-1980s through the early 2000s, women began disappearing and dying across south-central Los Angeles. Many were found in alleys, dumpsters, or vacant lots. Some were strangled, others were shot. Most were poor, many were sex workers, almost all were black. At the time, the killings were not treated as a single story. They were filed separately, investigated unevenly, and often deprioritized entirely. Franklin noticed that immediately. He was a city employee, a garbage truck driver, a husband, a father, a neighbor people waved to. His job gave him movement, access, and invisibility. He drove the same streets where bodies would later be found, wearing a uniform that explained his presence anywhere, at any hour. He watched how police responded and, more importantly, how often they didn't. The murders continued, spaced just far enough apart to dissolve urgency. When connections were finally made, the task force formed to hunt the killer was underfunded and politically isolated. Internally, he became known as the Grim Sleeper, a name that implied long dormant periods between killings. What investigators didn't know was that Franklin hadn't stopped. He had simply shifted methods, locations, and visibility. He believed he was evolving faster than the investigation. DNA evidence existed early on. Biological material was recovered from several crime scenes. But in the late 1980s and 1990s, DNA databases were small, incomplete, and heavily dependent on prior arrests. Franklin had none that mattered. His DNA sat in evidence lockers, potent but anonymous, waiting for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Years passed, task forces disbanded, files gathered dust, families aged, witnesses died. Franklin stayed where he was, rooted in the same neighborhood where his victims had vanished. Convinced that proximity was protection, he didn't move away from the crime scenes. He lived inside them. What finally changed was not his behavior, but the science. By the early 2000s, investigators revisiting cold cases began to apply emerging forensic genealogy techniques, methods that didn't require a suspect to be in a criminal database. They only required relatives. Franklin didn't know it, but his daughter had been arrested on a felony weapons charge. Her DNA was entered into the system. That single data point cracked open decades of silence. The familial DNA did not name Franklin immediately. It narrowed the field. It created a genetic relationship where none had existed before. From there, detectives began traditional surveillance. They followed him, watched his routines, waited, and again, it was the trash that betrayed him. Discarded items, eaten food, personal waste were collected and tested. When the results came back, the match was overwhelming. The DNA from multiple murder scenes aligned with Lonnie Franklin Jr. at levels that left no room for interpretation. The killer, who believed himself forgotten, had been identified not by a mistake, not by a confession, but by his own bloodline. His arrest in 2010 stunned the city, but it devastated his neighborhood. People struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the allegations. His wife collapsed in disbelief. His children faced a legacy they never asked for. And the families of the victims were forced to confront the truth that justice, when delayed, does not arrive gently. At trial, the evidence was methodical and merciless. DNA, ballistics, photographs recovered from Franklin's home, images of women, some later identified as victims, stored like trophies. The narrative that had once been fragmented was now undeniable. Franklin was convicted of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He died in prison in 2020. Never offering a public explanation, never expressing remorse, never acknowledging the full scope of what investigators believe he did. Even now, authorities suspect there are more victims whose names will never be spoken in court. Lonnie Franklin Jr. thought he had gotten away because the world around him taught him that certain lives did not trigger urgency. He exploited indifference. He relied on underfunding, bias, and institutional fatigue. And for decades, it worked. Until DNA stopped asking permission. The technology that exposed him did not care about neighborhoods, race, or reputation. It did not forget patterns. It did not lose interest. It waited patiently for the smallest opening and, when it arrived, it rebuilt the past with brutal precision. Killers who believe they've escaped justice often misunderstand what time does. Time does not erase evidence. It preserves it, quietly, invisibly, until science catches up. Franklin lived long enough to see the moment his certainty collapsed. The city he thought had buried his crimes handed them back to him, reconstructed cell by cell, leaving no place left to hide. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Joseph James DeAngelo built his life on the belief that history had lost interest in him. For decades, he lived quietly in California, aging into obscurity while the crimes that once terrorized an entire state slowly receded into legend. He had been known by many names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, but to the public, he had become a myth, a faceless monster from another era, assumed either dead or long gone. That assumption was his shield. Between the mid-1970s and mid-1980s, DeAngelo committed a sprawling series of crimes that defied conventional understanding. He stalked neighborhoods methodically. He broke into homes weeks or months before attacks, learning floor plans, testing windows, leaving small disturbances that victims would later remember with horror. He raped dozens of women. He murdered at least 13 people. He taunted police, whispering threats over the phone, leaving investigators chasing a voice that always stayed one step ahead. And then he stopped. No dramatic capture, no confession, no final crime scene. The violence simply ended, and the trail went cold. Task forces dissolved. Evidence aged. Investigators retired or died. DeAngelo disappeared into the statistical noise of millions of ordinary men. He became exactly what he needed to be: forgettable. What he did not account for was that the evidence he left behind was not decaying the way memory does. Semen samples collected from rape kits in the 1970s and 80s were carefully preserved. At the time, they were useless beyond blood typing. DNA technology barely existed. DeAngelo understood this. He relied on it. He believed that the past's limitations would protect him forever. For years, he was right. The case remained one of the most infamous unsolved crime sprees in American history. Books were written. Podcasts revived interest. Amateur sleuths obsessed over patterns, but nothing broke the stalemate. No suspect could be named. No arrest could be justified. Then, quietly, the rules changed. In the mid-2010s, investigators began exploring a radical idea: using public genealogy databases to identify suspects not by their own DNA, but by that of their relatives. This approach had never been used successfully at this scale. It relied on ordinary people uploading their genetic profiles to learn about ancestry, completely unaware they were contributing to criminal investigations. DeAngelo never submitted DNA. He never needed to. Someone in his family did. From that single genetic connection, analysts began constructing an enormous family tree, hundreds of names, branching backward and outward across generations. Birth records, death certificates, census data, marriage licenses. The work was slow, tedious, and relentless. Each branch narrowed the possibilities until only a handful of men fit the profile: the right age, the right location, the right history. Joseph James DeAngelo rose to the top. Investigators did not rush in. They watched. They followed him through grocery store parking lots and suburban streets. They waited for him to discard anything that carried his DNA: a tissue, a cup, trash from his curb. When the sample was collected and tested, the result was not ambiguous. The DNA matched the crime scene evidence with staggering certainty. The man who believed himself erased was suddenly, definitively present again. In April 2018, DeAngelo was arrested outside his home. He was 72 years old. The moment shattered decades of assumptions. Neighbors were stunned. Former co-workers struggled to reconcile the quiet mechanic they knew with the man accused of some of the most sadistic crimes in U.S. history. Survivors watched in disbelief as the face of their nightmares finally materialized, not as a monster frozen in time, but as an aging man who had lived freely while they carried the weight of what he'd done. In court, DeAngelo did not fight the evidence. He did not challenge the science. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and admitted to dozens of rapes. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and controlled. There was no dramatic breakdown, no explanation, only acknowledgement. DNA had done what decades of traditional investigation could not. What makes DeAngelo's exposure so significant is not just the scale of his crimes, but the precedent it set. His arrest proved that time no longer protects killers the way it once did. That evidence collected generations earlier can suddenly become lethal to secrecy. That anonymity is temporary when biology is permanent. DeAngelo thought he had outlasted justice. In reality, justice had been waiting for the right language to speak. Today, he will die in prison, not as a legend, not as a mystery, but as a man whose certainty collapsed under the weight of his own genetic code. Killers who believe they've gotten away often misunderstand what DNA represents. It is not just evidence, it is memory. And unlike witnesses, unlike institutions, unlike headlines, it does not forget. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Gary Ridgway. For nearly 2 decades, Gary Ridgway lived with a certainty that bordered on arrogance. He believed that the river had erased his sins. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, women disappeared along the highways and industrial corridors of Washington state. Many were last seen hitchhiking. Many were sex workers. Many were young, vulnerable, and easy for society to overlook. Their bodies began appearing near the Green River, scattered across wooded ravines, embankments, and isolated fields. Some were found quickly, others would not be discovered for years, sometimes decades. The media gave the killer a name, the Green River Killer. Ridgway watched the coverage closely. He followed the investigation not with fear, but with calculation. He understood something critical very early on. The sheer number of victims would overwhelm the system. Jurisdictional overlap, limited forensic technology, and the social status of the victims created a perfect storm of delay and misdirection. He inserted himself directly into the investigation. Ridgway volunteered to speak with police. He submitted to questioning. He even provided DNA samples in the 1980s, confident they would lead nowhere. At the time, DNA testing was in its infancy. Samples could be collected, but matching them reliably across crime scenes was slow, expensive, and often inconclusive. Ridgway knew this. He relied on it. He continued killing. By his own later admission, he murdered at least 49 women, though investigators believe the true number may be significantly higher. He strangled them, often within minutes of meeting them. He revisited body sites. He posed victims. He used the landscape like a filing system, confident that nature would finish what he started. Police came close more than once. Witnesses placed Ridgway with victims shortly before their disappearances. Polygraph tests raised suspicion. His name surfaced repeatedly, but each time, the case slipped away. The DNA evidence could not definitively link him to the murders. And so Ridgway learned the most dangerous lesson a serial killer can learn. The system can look directly at you and still let you go. He stopped killing not because he feared capture, but because he believed he had completed what he set out to do. He married, he worked, he lived quietly, convinced the worst was behind him. He was wrong. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA science changed fundamentally. Testing became more precise. Samples once considered inconclusive were re-examined. Evidence stored for years suddenly became usable. Investigators returned to old suspects with new tools. Ridgway's DNA was tested again. This time, there was no ambiguity. The semen recovered from multiple victims matched Gary Ridgway with absolute certainty. The man who had stood in interrogation rooms decades earlier, calm and confident, was now exposed by the very evidence he had dismissed as primitive. In 2001, Ridgway was arrested. The revelation was devastating for investigators and families alike. He had been on their radar for years. He had spoken to police. He had given them his DNA. And still, he had gone home every night, free to live his life, while families waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. When Ridgway confessed, it was not out of remorse. It was strategy. He offered information in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He led investigators to remains. He described murders with chilling detachment. He spoke of victims as objects, as tasks completed. His cooperation closed cases, but it also reopened wounds that had barely healed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ridgway believed that the river, the woods, and time itself had protected him. What he failed to understand was that evidence does not age the way people do. It waits, quietly, patiently, preserving truth at a molecular level until the world catches up. DNA did not just expose Gary Ridgway, it rewrote the rules. His case became a turning pointer, warning to killers who believed that early forensic limitations were permanent loopholes. They weren't, they were delays, and delays, eventually, expire. Ridgway will never leave prison. His certainty dissolved under a microscope, reduced to genetic markers that told a story he could no longer control. The killer who once walked freely among investigators now exists only as evidence, testimony, and regret that arrived decades too late for so many. Killers who think they've gotten away often forget one thing: science does not forget them. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. Robert Pickton. For years, Robert Pickton lived inside a nightmare that no one wanted to look at too closely. His pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, was infamous long before police ever searched it. Locals knew it as a place of rot, noise, and unease. People joked about it, warned each other about it, avoided it when they could. But no one imagined that beneath the filth and decay was one of the largest mass murder scenes in Canadian history. Pickton believed that disgust was camouflage. Throughout the 1990s, women vanished from Vancouver's downtown East Side area, already drowning in addiction, poverty, and indifference. Many were sex workers. Many struggled with substance abuse. Many had no one powerful enough to demand immediate answers when they disappeared. Their absence blended into the background of a city that had grown used to loss. Pickton watched this carefully. He frequented the area, picked women up, took them back to his farm under the pretense of parties, money, or shelter. Some were never seen again. Others vanished so quietly that even their last movements were uncertain. The disappearances stacked up, but investigations moved slowly, hindered by limited resources and deeply rooted bias about whose lives mattered. Pickton believed the system had already decided not to look. For years, police received tips about the farm. Witnesses reported strange behavior. Women spoke of narrow escapes. One woman survived an attack by Pickton and went to police with handcuffs still attached to her wrist. Even then, the response was delayed, cautious, and fragmented. Warrants were partial. Searches were limited. Opportunities slipped through bureaucratic cracks. Pickton stayed where he was. He did not flee. He did not clean up. He did not stop. The farm became a graveyard disguised as a business, and he trusted that the chaos itself would protect him. He believed the sheer scale of the filth made the truth unthinkable. When police finally executed a full search warrant in 2002, they were unprepared for what they found. Human remains were everywhere mixed with animal remains, embedded in soil, stored in freezers, scattered across the property. Some were unrecognizable. Others were fragmentary beyond immediate identification. The scene was so contaminated, so degraded, that many believed prosecution would be impossible. Pickton believed that too. But DNA does not need a clean scene. It only needs consistency. Investigators painstakingly recovered bone fragments, teeth, and trace biological material. Each piece was catalogued, tested, compared. Slowly, identities began to emerge. Women who had vanished years earlier were suddenly present again, not in photographs, not in memories, but in genetic markers that could not be denied. Pickton was charged with multiple counts of murder. At trial, the defense argued that the remains were too fragmented, too compromised, too uncertain to support conviction. That argument failed. DNA evidence tied specific victims directly to Pickton's property and actions. The randomness he relied on collapsed under scientific precision. Perhaps most chilling was Pickton's own belief system, revealed later through recorded statements. He believed he had beaten the system because he understood it better than it understood him. He believed that targeting women no one searched for aggressively gave him immunity. He believed that the scale of his crimes would paradoxically protect him, that it would be too much to process. He was wrong. Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder. though investigators believe the true number of victims may exceed 40. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for decades. DNA did what witnesses, tips, and intuition could not. It took chaos and turned it into clarity. It gave names back to women who had been reduced to statistics. It forced a reckoning not just with one man, but with the institutional failures that allowed him to operate in plain sight for so long. Robert Pickton thought filth erased evidence. Instead, it preserved it. The farm he believed would bury the truth became the very place where it was reconstructed piece by piece. His certainty that no one would ever untangle what he had done collapsed under the quiet, methodical patience of forensic science. Killers who think they've gotten away often confuse neglect with immunity. Pickton relied on that confusion for years. DNA did not care who the victims were or how long they had been gone. It spoke for them when no one else had, and when it finished speaking, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 6. Dennis Rader believed discipline would save him. For decades, he lived by rigid routines. He woke early, he worked steadily, he served his church, he enforced rules in his neighborhood. He catalogued his life the way he catalogued his crimes, with order, structure, and the absolute confidence that control equaled safety. While the city of Wichita searched for a monster, Dennis Rader became the embodiment of normalcy. Convinced that time had buried what he had done, between 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered 10 people, families, women, children. He bound them, tortured them, and killed them in their own homes. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, turning human suffering into an acronym he could repeat to himself like a mantra. He taunted police with letters, poems, and diagrams, inserting himself into the investigation not because he feared capture, but because he needed recognition. Then he stopped. The murders ceased without explanation. The letters stopped. The city exhaled cautiously, assuming the killer had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for something else. BTK became a case study, a relic of a darker era. Detectives retired. Evidence went into storage. Survivors tried to rebuild lives around unanswered questions. Rader watched all of it unfold, certain the silence meant victory. He married, raised children, advanced at work, became a church leader, served as a compliance officer, issuing citations and fines with the same cold authority he once used to terrorize families. The irony was not lost on him. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed knowing that the man enforcing rules had once broken the most fundamental one imaginable. What he did not understand, what he could not understand, was that evidence weights differently than memory. In the early 2000s, Rader's need for attention resurfaced. He began sending letters again, unable to resist the urge to remind the world that he was still alive. He asked police whether floppy disks could be traced. Investigators answered publicly, no. It was a lie, carefully placed, and Rader believed it without hesitation. He sent the disk. Embedded within it was metadata information that traced the file back to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church and to a user named Dennis. From there, suspicion crystallized rapidly. Investigators did not rush. They watched. They followed him. They waited for confirmation that could not be explained away. That confirmation came from DNA. Rader had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. His DNA was not in any criminal database. For years, that fact alone protected him. But the science had changed, and so had the rules. Investigators obtained a sample from a routine medical procedure involving Rader's daughter, completely unrelated to crime. The familial match was undeniable. The killer who believed he had engineered the perfect disappearance was exposed not by a mistake at a crime scene, but by biology itself. When Rader was arrested in 2005, he did not rage. He did not deny. He corrected details. He took notes. He treated the interrogation like a lecture, proud of his methods, proud of his longevity, proud that he had remained hidden for so long. He had spent decades imagining this moment, and now that it had arrived, he wanted to control it too. In court, his confession was meticulous and chilling. He described each murder with the same procedural detachment he had always used. He explained his fantasies, his planning, his need to revisit memories. There was no remorse, only satisfaction that his story would finally be heard in full. But the story no longer belonged to him. DNA had stripped away the mythology. It reduced BTK from a phantom into a man whose certainty collapsed under scientific scrutiny. The same technology that had once been too primitive to catch him had evolved quietly, relentlessly, until it made his secrecy obsolete. What makes Rader's exposure especially haunting is how little he had changed. He did not adapt. He did not anticipate the future. He assumed that the limitations of the past were permanent. That assumption became his undoing. Killers who think they've gotten away often believe the world freezes at the moment they stop killing. It doesn't. Science advances. Databases grow. Techniques sharpen. Evidence that once whispered becomes capable of speaking clearly, even decades later. Dennis Rader thought discipline made him invisible. Instead, it preserved him perfectly intact for the moment when invisibility would no longer be possible. When DNA finally spoke, it did not shout. It simply stated a fact Rader could never control. The past was not finished with him, and it never will be. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 7. John Bittrolff believed geography had saved him. For years, the marshes and wooded edges of eastern Long Island absorbed violence without explanation. Women disappeared along quiet roads, their bodies later discovered in places designed by nature to delay discovery. The killings did not come in rapid succession. They were spaced apart, separated by years, just far enough to prevent urgency from solidifying into obsession. To investigators, they looked like isolated tragedies. To Bittrolff, they looked like permanence. He lived nearby, worked nearby, raised a family nearby. He did not flee after killing. He stayed close, convinced that familiarity dissolved suspicion. The roads that carried victims to their deaths were the same roads he drove daily. Ordinary routines became his shield. In the early 1990s, 2 women were found brutally murdered in Suffolk County. Both had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and left in remote areas. The crimes were violent, personal, and chaotic, but they lacked the clean signature patterns investigators relied on to connect cases definitively. At the time, forensic science could not do what instinct suspected. DNA was collected. It went nowhere. For years, the evidence sat dormant. The samples were incomplete, degraded, or simply unmatched. Bittrolff knew this. He trusted it. He trusted that evidence without a name was just another unsolved file. One more weight the system could not lift. He continued living his life. The families of the victims did not stop waiting, but the case slowed to a crawl. Detectives retired. Leads evaporated. What little momentum existed faded under newer crimes demanding immediate attention. The murderers slipped quietly into the category killers love most: unresolved. Then, in 2013, a separate investigation changed everything. Police were re-examining cold cases using advances in DNA testing that did not exist when the murders occurred. Improved sensitivity allowed analysts to extract usable genetic profiles from samples once considered insufficient. The DNA from the 1990s murders was tested again, not with hope, but with obligation. This time, it spoke. The profile did not belong to someone in the database, but it was close enough to suggest familial connection. Investigators followed that lead carefully, aware that one mistake could collapse the entire case. They built family trees, cross-referenced ages, mapped addresses. Slowly, deliberately, the data circled back to a name that had never been seriously considered before. John Bittrolff. He had no criminal history that would have placed his DNA on file. He had never drawn attention to himself. He had done everything right according to killers who rely on time to do their erasing. But time had not erased him. It had preserved him for better tools. Police obtained his DNA legally and quietly. The match was undeniable. The man who believed distance between crimes had dissolved connection was confronted with science that thrives on patterns invisible to the naked eye. Bittrolff was arrested in 2014, decades after the murders, his certainty collapsing in a matter of hours. In court, the defense argued coincidence. They argued contamination. They argued reasonable doubt. DNA dismantled every argument. It placed Bittrolff at the center of violence he believed had been scattered beyond reconstruction. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to decades in prison. What makes Bittrolff's case especially chilling is not notoriety, but patience. He was not a prolific killer by public standards. He did not seek attention. He did not taunt police. He trusted obscurity more than ego. and for a long time, that trust was rewarded, until DNA made obscurity irrelevant. His arrest sent shockwaves through communities that had lived alongside him for years. Neighbors questioned memories, families revisited old conversations, the unsettling truth settled in slowly. Monsters do not always announce themselves, sometimes they wait, believing silence is permanent. DNA proved it isn't. Killers who think they've gotten away often believe the past is fixed, that what wasn't solved then can never be solved now. Bittrolff learned, too late, that the past is not static. It is patient. It waits for the right language to tell the truth, and when it finally speaks, it does not ask permission. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 8. John Edward Robinson. Everyone assumed he was harmless. To his neighbors in Missouri, he was a soft-spoken, middle-aged businessman who seemed anxious but polite. He handed out business cards, talked about family values, and tried to sell used cars and industrial saw blades. He attended church when he remembered. He joked about his late-stage enlistment in the Air Force and claimed vague work in security contracting. Nothing about him suggested violence, let alone serial murder. But for years, bodies collected in places no one connected in till DNA uncovered the link. John Edward Robinson was born in 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri, to a working-class family. Childhood accounts suggest neither overt violence nor clear emotional instability. He was quiet, often brooding, capable of basic civility, but thinly veiling discontent. He had a family of his own, a wife and children. On the surface, he fulfilled the role of provider and patriarch, though those closest to him later described a man who dominated conversations, judged others harshly, and complained about life not giving him credit it owed him. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Robinson's life was patchwork, odd jobs, short-lived businesses, an arrest here and there for minor infractions. But there was nothing at the time to definitively mark him as a danger. To police, he was just another face in the crowd, no one violent, no one tracked for serious crime. The first potential warning signs were buried in paperwork: missing persons reports, unconnected disappearances, vague sightings of women who left town with a strange man, but no hard evidence, no bodies, no forensic proof linking anyone to anyone else. Then, in the mid-1980s and early 1990s, a series of disappearances and deaths began rippling through the Midwest and Texas. Women vanished. Husbands reported lost contacts that made no sense. Friends described plans abruptly cancelled. In some cases, skeletal remains were found near wooded areas, in shallow graves, or simply abandoned where scavengers would soon erase too many clues. At the time, police did what they could. Searches were conducted, autopsies performed, but unless a body had identification or clear cause of death, many cases never progressed beyond undetermined. The forensic technology of the era could recover a few fingerprints, perhaps some fibers, but not much more. DNA profiling existed in its earliest computational form, but databases were small, and cross-jurisdiction cooperation was minimal. Robinson, meanwhile, continued his life. He moved across states. He changed business names. He interacted with a variety of women, most of them struggling financially or emotionally. He claimed to broker loans. He claimed to have government contacts. He promised opportunities that never materialized. For women who met him, his offers sounded like lifelines, not traps. Between the late 1980s and mid-1990s, investigators became aware of a loose pattern, not in any single jurisdiction, but across states where missing women shared certain traits: vulnerable, often economically insecure, last seen with a man who claimed authority or business connections, no known next steps, and frequently forgotten once the trail went cold. But that pattern was not yet science, it was intuition. The breakthrough began not with a confession, not with a tip, but with patience and persistence. By the mid-1990s, DNA profiling had grown exponentially. Investigators began revisiting cold cases with new genetic tests, especially cases where biological material had been preserved but never fully analyzed. Skeletal remains, hair fibers, and even blood-spattered fabrics that once seemed unusable suddenly became goldmines of information. One such revisit occurred in Texas, where skeletal remains of an unidentified woman had been stored for years. The state crime lab, using updated DNA extraction techniques, produced a viable profile. They uploaded it into the National Combined DNA Index System. Within months, investigators received a partial match, one that indicated familial connection to DNA already in the system. But the match was not to a suspect. It was to a relative. Investigators followed the family tree backward and laterally, building a genetic map that eventually pointed to one name appearing repeatedly across borders, across business records, and across times when women went missing. John Edward Robinson. Once a suspect was formulated, law enforcement began surveillance. They obtained discarded items, coffee cups, napkins, cigarette butts, and extracted DNA that matched the crime scenes with overwhelming certainty. This was the breakthrough no one had decades earlier. DNA that could not be denied. DNA that crossed states and tied multiple cases to one man. In 1996, Robinson was arrested in Kansas. He did not flee. He did not resist. He remained outwardly composed. The charges involve the murder of Candy Rogers, a woman whose skeletal remains had been discovered in Texas years earlier. But the implications were much broader. DNA had exposed something far deeper, something that spread across time, geography, and state lines. During the investigation and subsequent trial, evidence piled up that far exceeded the original charges. Investigators found personal effects, bank records, and witness testimony linking Robinson to at least 5 confirmed murders, though some analysts believe the true number may be higher. DNA evidence placed him at or near scenes that had long been classified as unsolved. Robinson's methods were disturbingly opportunistic. He used his veneer of business legitimacy to approach women in vulnerability. He promised support, then refused to deliver it. When women threatened to expose him or flee, he killed them, often burying or concealing the remains in locations chosen for obscurity, not visibility. In court, Robinson did not mount a dramatic defense. He claimed memory lapses. He deflected blame. He insisted his interactions had been consensual or misinterpreted. But the DNA evidence was overwhelming. The genetic fingerprints that once sat dormant in evidence lockers now spoke loudly, unmistakably. They were the final witness in a courtroom that no longer accepted his casual denials. In 2001, Robinson was convicted of multiple counts of capital murder. He was sentenced to death in Texas, and later also received death sentences in Missouri and Kansas for additional killings. Appeals dragged on for years, but the genetic evidence remained unshakable. His execution was scheduled but repeatedly delayed. As of the latest verifiable reports, he remains incarcerated on death row. His sentences ensuring he will never see freedom again. The case of John Edward Robinson stands as a stark demonstration of how DNA transformed criminal justice. Before DNA became the centerpiece of forensic science, many victims went unnamed. Cases went cold. Patterns remained invisible. Investigators followed instinct and geography, but without genetic evidence. The connective tissue between crimes was too fragile to support conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Robinson rode that gap. He believed that the distance between states, between times, and between unconnected filings would shield him. He thought that the system's inability to match fingerprints or link ballistic reports would keep him safe. He was wrong. DNA does not forget. Biology stows itself in evidence where human memory fails. It waits patiently in cryogenic silence until technology catches up. When it does, it speaks in a language too precise to ignore. Killers like Robinson think they can outrun justice because justice once moved slowly. But DNA changed the definition of time in criminal investigation. Cold cases became hot again. Dormant profiles became keys. Names whispered in notebooks turned into names screaming in courtrooms. The families who waited decades for answers finally got them, not through confession, not through witness testimony, not through chance, but because DNA spoke when no human voice could. And the man who thought he got away discovered that biology never forgets. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.